We are all in. So hello everybody and welcome to the second day of National Hedgerow Week 2022. And thank you so much for joining our Hedge Talk, Heavenly Hedges, foraging for fantastic food and tasty tipples. And a very special welcome to all our Tree Council supporters and especially to our tree wardens, who I know some of them are here today. My name is Will Fitzpatrick and I am the Tree Council's Community Engagement Officer for our Hedgerow project, Talk to the Hedge. And I'm joined today by our special guest, David Winnard from Discover the Wild. Hello, Dave.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm good. I think we're all ready.
Very good. Thanks for joining us. Dave's been teaching foraging and other wildlife events for over 20 years, and is passionate about engaging people with the nature on their doorstep, as well as passing on the mythology and folklore that go along with each species. So today's talk is all about the amazing kind of things that we can find on hedgerows that we might be able to eat, and also that what we might want to stay well clear of. So the talk will last about 40 to 45 minutes. As we go along, there's a question and answers function just at the bottom of your pages. Any questions, just pop them in there, and then we'll try and get round to them at the end. Before I wanted to we get going, just wanted to introduce the Tree Council, what we do, and talk a little bit about our hedgerow project. So the Tree Council is a national charity that brings everyone together for the love of trees. We fund, plant and care trees, orchards and hedgerows with the help of our amazing volunteers and our incredible partners, and also through our community grant schemes. We aim to inspire the next generation of environmentalists through our National Schools programme. We influence national policy with practical science and research, and we work closely with our incredible partners to create healthier, greener futures for ourselves, our wildlife, and the planet. So following on from the success of our Close the Gap project, National Hedgerow Week is part of our ongoing project, Talk to the Hedge. This is a 3-year programme that aims to benefit biodiversity, climate change, and the green economy by increasing the quality and quantity of both our urban and our rural hedgerows all across England. So the programme is being led by the Tree Council and works in partnership with Farmers and Wildlife Advisory Group, People's Trust for Endangered Species, the National Hedge Laying Society, and Another Way. And we're funded by the Trees Call to Action Fund, which is delivered by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and has been developed by DEFRA in partnership with the Forestry Commission. And yes, they're helping us to deliver this project. So we thank them. If you want more information about any of our projects, please go to our website, www.treecouncil.org.uk. And for anything hedge related and all the information about how you can get involved with hedgerow projects, go to the HedgeLink website, which is www.hedgelink.org.uk. And that's enough from me for the time being. So I'm going to hand over to Dave, and yes, tell us about foraging for things on our hedgerows.
Cheers. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to share my screen now, so you should be able to see this. Will's got a very important job today because he's the only person I can actually physically see. So if he nods his head, then we know we're doing well. If I see him drifting off, then it's just a typical talk from my point of view. I'm not sure if the Tree Council want this. Is just out of my interest. If anyone wants in the chat function to put whereabouts they're from in the UK, it'd be interesting to get an idea of where everyone's joining us from tonight. Anyway, so I'm Dave Winnard, and I run a company called Discover the Wild. It's my own company, and basically I teach lots of aspects in natural history, mainly foraging. You know, I was brought up on mushrooms, basically, and I was brought up with my grandma taking me out into the woods. Football was just instilled on me from a young age. The whole family was mad and on football as well as being mad. But when I was about 5, they sent me off to soccer academy and things like that, and I just rebelled against it. It was being forced on me so much that every Saturday, when the family would go and watch Oldham Athletic, because they were season tickets for Oldham Athletics when they were still good, I used to get dropped off with Grandma, and Grandma used to go off into the woods to look for fungi, and I would be her little truffle hound, and she would pay me to find mushrooms, 1 penny for a common species, 2 pennies if it was uncommon, and 5 pennies if it was rare. And at the end of the walk, whatever I'd earned in mushrooms, I got in sweets. But she just instilled that kind of love of nature, of just going out into the woods and being amongst the trees and just looking for all these magical kind of mushrooms and brackets and corals and all sorts of stuff. And then as I got a little bit older, I started to develop an interest in birds and dragonflies and plants. And then I went to university, had 6 options for university. 5 were in medicine, 1 was in wildlife photography. I ended up doing wildlife photography as my degree. And when I was at uni, I was leading events in my spare time to try and make some extra beer money. And I just loved it. I loved taking people out into the countryside and showing them things they had no idea about, or showing them a plant or a mushroom that they thought they knew something about, but then taking it to another level. So hopefully we can do that tonight with some of you. Because when we are foraging, when I talk to people about foraging, a lot of people say, oh, I don't feel confident. I wouldn't know what to pick, especially when it comes to mushrooms. We'll deal with some mushrooms in the latter part. But when we're foraging, it's all about building up your confidence. Because most people say, oh, I wouldn't go foraging. But then they say they pick blackberries, or they pick this plant, which is wild garlic. And of course, that is foraging. If you go for a walk and you pick blackberries, that's foraging. And most of the things we are foraging for are relatively common. Doesn't matter, lovely to see we've got a very mixed kind of where we're from in the UK tonight on the chat. All of the species I'm going to talk about are found right across the UK. When we're foraging, we're not targeting rare species. Foraging should never have a negative impact on the environment. I'll explain more about that shortly. But this plant sums up foraging for beginners for me. This is wild garlic, or what many people refer to as wild garlic. Its correct botanical name is ramsons. And any part of the country that's named Rams something is generally named after this plant. So Ramsbottom, not far from where I grew up in the north of Greater Manchester, is named after this plant. Ramsey in Kent is named after this plant. There's lots of areas named after this plant. Its scientific name is Allium ursinum. So it's an onion, and ursinum relates to bear. Ursinum means bear. So this is bear onion, supposedly because bears often like to roll around in this plant to mask their scent in the spring. Which apparently is quite adorable when they do it. When I do it, I get a knock on the door from the police, but each to their own. But it's one of these plants that once you see and once you handle, it's so distinctive. People say it smells of garlic. I totally disagree with this. I think it smells strongly of spring onions. When you dry the plant, then it starts to smell a bit more garlicky. But it's because you instill this idea that it's called wild garlic, and therefore it tastes and smells of garlic. If we called it wild spring onion, I think it would be a bit more on the nose, but maybe I'm in the minority here. And this is a common plant we get right through for our woodlands and our hedgerows. Where I live in North Wales, it is a common hedgerow plant. Grows underneath usually lots of hawthorn and a kind of ash hedges all around. And it's wonderful. It's one of my favorite things to use it fresh for making pestos and soups, but we dry the leaves as well. But foraging seasonal, I'm going to include lots of species that are out perfect for picking now and over the next few weeks. But of course, what we forage for in spring is totally different to what we're foraging for this time of the year. And if we were doing this talk 6 weeks ago, there would have been totally different things ready, from now. And this is the species I kind of long for at this time of the year, because it's almost the longest time since we can have wild garlic fresh. Because actually, if you want really fresh if you go into a wood or there's a really good hedgerow near you, or a really good old hedge that's got wild garlic and it smells, that's because it's rotting. So one of my best pieces of advice for people who are picking wild garlic is if you go into an area and it stinks of wild garlic, it's because the leaves are starting to rot. The leaves are best February, March, very early April. And then as we get into April, May, when it starts flowering, then we can use the flowers and the stem. And then once it's finished flowering, you can use the seeds, and the seeds thrown into some vinegar, pickled, are absolutely delicious and so easy to do. Literally get a jar, put a load of the seeds in it, and then cover it with kind of hot pickling vinegar, flavored to how you like it. Leave it, done. It's fantastic. But I wanted to mention early on about the ecological considerations when we are foraging. And in reality, if we are going out picking things for ourselves, then the impact we would have on the environment is pretty negligible, especially with what we're picking. When we start to get into commercial foraging, which is no longer foraging anyway, that's where it could be more of an issue. But for example, wild garlic, there is a species of hoverfly whose whole life cycle depends on wild garlic. So if we went into an area and took all the wild garlic, then this hoverfly, as tiny as it is a very, very small fly, has nowhere to live. So we don't want that. You know, we are happy with taking some fresh leaves and things for us, but the plant will grow back. If anyone who picks areas from wild garlic almost evolved to be grazed. And as soon as you pick it, it stimulates it to grow even more and bushier. Like if anyone who grows, you know, cut and come again kind of lettuces at home, the more you pick, the more it grows. But we don't want to take a whole area, not just wild garlic, with anything. We need to leave lots for nature and for other people to enjoy as well. So in spring, I challenge you to find the Ramson's hoverfly. You just sit down in a nice area and have a look for this. And its whole life cycle depends on this one plant. So we can kind of have a tasty meal and admire this lovely hoverfly while we're there. But foraging is never static. So there'll be lots of things that we could have, you know, you will find in books and herbals going back hundreds of years, recipes and things like that. But some plants especially are just increased dramatically. So this is Danish scurvy grass. And I remember being a young lad, being taken to see this in Greater Manchester because it was the first time it had ever been seen. Now it's one of the commonest plants in Greater Manchester and around the UK, especially along the road network. And that's how this plant spread. It's a coastal plant, so it shouldn't be anywhere near Greater Manchester, really, a landlocked county. But because we grit the roads with a lot of salt and things like that, the plant spread and is now found in, you know, the central reservations of motorway around April, May just become lilac with this plant, low growing plant, which has shovelly shaped leaves. And with a name like common scurvy grass, you'll never guess what it was used for treating. The leaves are full of vitamin C, and it was often dried and eaten on voyages to ward off scurvy. But this is, you know, like I was saying, if we went back to the 90s and people, you would say, I commonly pick Danish scurvy grass in the spring, people wouldn't have believed you. Whereas now it's absolutely everywhere. So things are always changing. Some things, however, never change. Every forager's favorite plant. This is blackthorn. I say favorite, I'll explain why in a second. When we're foraging, we always want little hints and tips to make it much, much easier. Apps are a no-no. We can't rely on apps. We've got to learn it all properly. And the great thing with blackthorn is it flowers before the leaves come out. So early spring, you'll see hedgerows that just turn white like snow with no green. And that's an easy way of how you tell blackthorn from hawthorn, because hawthorn leaves before it flowers. So you end up, if you've got a blackthorn and hawthorn hedge, you end up with, in spring, usually around April, May, you end up with white and then green, white and green, you know, from when the species kind of alternate. And we're interested in blackthorn because if we find it in the spring when it's easy to see, then later, oh, I've put the wrong slide in. There we go. I'll come back to the others. Then later in the year, we can pick the sloes. So it's a blackthorn that produces sloes. And of course, we're interested in sloes for making sloe gin, possibly the most sought after hedgerow recipe there is. I have no idea why. Absolutely no idea why. Sloe gin is delicious. There are far better things to make from the hedgerow than sloe gin, but it's this kind of conjures up a romantic British idea of messing around with the hedgerows and making a delicious tipple in time for putting your feet up by the fire around Christmas. Blackthorn, so it's not, they're not blackthorn berries, and it's not a sloe bush. That's just one that doesn't grow very quickly. A sloe, S-O-L-E. It's just a tiny member of the plum family. But if you were to try one raw, like literally off the bush, it dries your mouth out, gives you cotton mouth. It's horrendous. Then you understand why the only kind of recipe there is with sloes is whack them in gin and sugar for 3 months and forget about it. There are far more interesting things to mess with, but blackthorn's incredibly common. And it's just, if you're going to make sloe gin, what you need to do is wait for the first frost, which is getting harder and harder and harder to do each year. And you pick a thorn from the blackthorn, and you then prick every sloe you have picked with the thorn from the blackthorn you picked it from, and then you put them in a kilner jar, add sugar, fill it with gin, close it, forget about it. No one's got time for doing this kind of traditional recipe anymore. Who's got time to be pricking every sloe they pick with a thorn from their own blackthorn? Then you just use a potato masher or cut them up or somewhere like that. But what you really want to find are bullaces. Now, bullaces and damsons are very, very similar. These are bullaces because these are very round. They're bigger than sloes. These are the size of a kind of, a biggish marble, not the small marble. Sloes are like the small marbles. These are like the big marbles. And damsons generally are elongated and oval, and they are a named variety. They could originate from Damascus in Syria, which is where the name damson comes from. And lots of people make damson gin or damson chutneys or damson jam using bullaces because they're not the real ones. There are lots of damsons around in our hedgerows, but bullaces are a different, they taste the same, but they're not the same variety, if this makes sense. These are far sweeter, they're bigger, they're easier to work with than sloes. So I've given up over the years in making sloe gin. I'm far more interested in making bullas gin. So this is the recipe. When we're foraging, we never have recipes where it's like, oh, you use 75 grams of this to 100. You get a carrier bag. Everything's measurements in carrier bags, and that depends on how big your carrier bag is. And the other thing is kilner jars. So whenever we make a liqueur, it is a kilner jar, however kind of big, and it doesn't have to be a real kilner. It can be, the flip top ones like these. And you fill it 2/3 full of the fruit. You fill it with sugar to taste and start with a little, and you can always add more. You can't take away sugar. And then top up with the spirit of your choice. That could be gin, that could be vodka, that could be whiskey, that could be, whatever you want. Spice rum, wild black cherry and spice rum is absolutely delicious, but we'll leave that one for another day. And then we leave it. You got to prick the fruit to make sure the fruit's infused. But generally with fruit, it's a 3-month infusion. There's not much point leaving the fruit in there much longer than that. It's not really going to do anything. And after 6 months, might even start spoiling it. And I use Karoon gin mainly because I've worked with them over the years when they used to forage, but then they got so big they can no longer forage. They have to grow everything. But I like it. It's a gin I would drink neat. So if I'm making, a damson gin, I use a base of a gin that I would like, because it's okay saying just use something cheap. If you like that, that's great. Use that. But if it's a gin that you would try neat and it doesn't taste very nice and you're not like it, well, there's a mathematical formula that, if you put rubbish in, you get rubbish out. So always use a tipple of your choice. The only thing to say is if you're thinking about making liqueurs, and lots of you probably will at the moment, because it is that time of year for making things like sloe gin and damson gin, is once you start adding fruit and sugar, you start to dilute the alcohol in the drink. And if it falls below 20%, it is no longer a preservative. So if you start with a really cheap gin, and cheap gins are cheap because they're generally under 40% alcohol, the tax threshold changes at 40%. So premium gins are 40% higher, and cheaper gins are 37.5%, because basically they're adding water. And if you start with something that's 37.5%, by the time you dilute it, you may end up going under 20%, whereas that extra 2.5% might keep you just above. So however long you're thinking about keeping this in the cupboard, might make a difference in which gin or spirit you use. Vodka's great. And yeah, I think I've said enough about that, to be honest. Otherwise, I'm starting to think I'll just nip downstairs and get a bottle myself. I'm going to go back because we can talk about other invasive things. So sometimes in the hedgerows, we find plants that aren't really wanted. Stuart's mentioned quince gin. Yes, you can be. This is the great thing, is that recipe of 2/3, full of fruit and sugar and alcohol. Replace the fruit with any fruit you want, add sugar to taste, and any spirit you want. So you could make blackberry vodka, you could make, like I say, wild cherry spiced rum, you could do, quince gin, you can do, anything you fancy. And it's great. Making hedgerow wines is always very difficult. The difference between a good hedgerow wine and a really bad hedgerow vinegar, making the same thing, it can go either way. Whereas when you're flavoring a spirit, you can't really go wrong, really. Anyway, so, but if you wanted something else to play with, Japanese rose, Rosa rugosa, commonly planted in lots of hedgerows around the UK because it's a kind of cheap plant. It keeps people out where they shouldn't be. So councils and municipal areas love this plant because like I say, it keeps people out. The byproduct is it produces lovely single flowering rose petals that stink of Turkish delight. Like literally this plant smells like you've been punched in the face with a box of Turkish delight. The hips later in the year, which produces a big fat tomato-like hips, they're rubbish. They've got no flavor at all. But this plant is quite invasive around some of the sand dune areas around and the coastal areas around North Wales. We almost have to get rid of this plant because it can become quite invasive in kind of sand dune areas. It just becomes kind of big and shrubby and pretty horrendous, to be fair. So if we're taking all the petals off it to make a lovely kind of rose liqueur or a rose syrup or Turkish delight, so much so. This isn't foraging. This is now conservation in action. We're coming to the defense of the wildlife realm by making delicious things. So whenever we're using plants, whether it's about the scent and the infusion, you smell every flower, because if it doesn't have a scent, it's not going to add any flavor. So every time you find a Japanese rose, give it a whiff, and if you're not smells like you're being punched in the face with a box of Turkish delight, don't use it. On a hot sunny day, this is the most wonderful plant. Rose is a very much love it or hate it scent. It's a bit like working with lavender in foraging, is that some people can associate it with soap or perfume, because if you make a lavender liqueur, people smell it and just immediately think perfume because you've got that alcohol and lavender kind of smell. Rose can be a bit similar, but a rose liqueur, oh my word, fill the kiln jar 2/3 with Japanese rose petals, and then add something like vodka. And the key here is citric acid, because what citric acid does is it breaks down the leaves, and you'll literally see within minutes the leaves start to bleed the color into the liquid. If you didn't do that, you just end up with very wet petals and vodka that doesn't taste of anything else. It just doesn't mix. The citric acid starts to break it down. You see the color run into the liquid and start to infuse all of its flavor. It's absolutely delicious. One of my favorite things. So John's asking, don't hedgerows belong to someone, and can we forage in people's gardens or farms? Gardens pretty much off limits, I'm afraid. Without that, we're getting into the realms of trespass and things like that. We can, the law on foraging is legally we're allowed to hit the 4 Fs, which is flowers, fruits, foliage, and fungi. And so long as they're from a public kind of space, that's fine. If you're picking for your own personal consumption, that's fine. If you're picking blackberries from a public park or things like that, and there are no bylaws prohibiting you, and the bylaws will be very clearly marked, etc. Or if you're on a national nature reserve, etc., that prohibit the removal of plants and things, then you're fine. You can pick nettles, you can pick wild garlic, you can pick apples, blackberries, whatever. If you were to label all that blackberry jam you've made and sell it, that's a criminal offense. So it's not yours to sell. So the commercial side of foraging is there are lots of laws in place. You can't just go around picking things that aren't yours to sell and selling it, if that makes sense. For your own personal consumption, that's fine. Some plants are protected by law. So all orchids, for example, are protected under the Schedule 8 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. You can't pick any part of an orchid without technically, a massive fine and a potential prison sentence. Not that you would be interested in orchids anyway, foraging. And it is illegal to uproot any wild plant without the landowner's permission. If you're foraging in your own garden, you can do what you want. If it's your friend's garden, that will be fine. As long as they say yes, that's fine as well. But gardens and farms, I would say, were off limits. Yeah. Anyway, ground elder. This is a common plant under hedgerows right the way through spring and summer, and it was not native. Most of the plants we're going to talk about are not really meant to be here when it comes to foraging. So lots of times in history, we've had the Romans, the Vikings, the Normans, they've all brought plants with them to the UK, because when they arrived here, they were like, God, there's nothing here. You need plants. So they brought lots of plants with them. And then later on, the Victorians kind of introduced lots of Interesting plants. We'll talk some more about that shortly. But ground elder, which the leaves kind of look a bit like elder, which we'll talk about shortly. It grows en masse on the ground. Lots of gardeners get in touch saying that it just grows rampant in their garden. It grows right everywhere. How do we get rid of it? It's edible. It's delicious. The reasons the Roman introduced it here is because they used it as a food plant. It has a very citrusy spinach kind of taste to it, and it is absolutely delicious. You just got to be slightly wary, because at the minute we're kind of celebrating lots of plants we can use. We'll talk about some of the ones you need to avoid shortly. Hawthorn, our commonest hedgerow plant. When we talk about hedgerow, immediately in my mind, I'm thinking hawthorn, you know, as the kind of the main species. It is just a stalwart in our countryside. It's hardy. It grows everywhere. It grows right up the kind of the side of the hillsides. You know, it's absolutely everywhere. And it's a neglected friend of the forager, because often at this time of the year we are looking for damsons and pears and plums, and you know, I mean, around Greater Manchester you get figs growing along the side of the river. You'd be amazed at some of the exotic things that grow in cities and towns. That urban microclimate, you can get some very weird things growing in the most unexpected places. But hawthorn, sometimes we neglect it, which is unfair, because it's a great plant to use, highly medicinal, in terms of it can lower blood pressure. So if you've got low blood pressure, you need to be slightly wary of hawthorn. We know if you've got high blood pressure, it can lower it. There is some evidence to suggest if it could raise it if it's low, to suggest hawthorn may regulate blood pressure. There's less evidence of that, and more evidence to suggest it just lowers it. So bear this in mind if you have low blood pressure. And all parts of it are edible. So the flowers and the leaves in the spring, and then at this time of the year, the fruit. They are all edible, and you can dry out the flowers and the leaves, and then mix them and make it with the fruit at this time of the year. Make a tea. If you want to be really healthy, you know, a hawthorn tea is the way to go about using it. It tastes incredibly healthy. It's not the most delicious of ways to use hawthorn. Hawthorn ketchup is probably the best thing to do at this time of the year. Lots of recipes online. If you just Google hawthorn ketchup, there'll be loads of recipes, and it is delicious. You could do a hawthorn liqueur as well. People think I have a drinking problem. I just have to remind them that alcohol is a preservative, and what we're trying to do is encapsulate all these wonderful flavors in different ways, and alcohol, you know, that's why I'm doing it, no other reason. And it's great. I mean, it is time consuming. You don't get a name like hawthorn without being a little bit sharp along parts of the branches and things like that. So, you know, you just have to be slightly more delicate when you're picking the fruits. And the great thing is there's so many of them. I mean, we always say leave some for the birds. In reality, there aren't enough birds in the world to eat all the hawthorn berries there are. There's that, you know, they are absolutely loads. And generally when you get a nice, good, a big hawthorn hedge, you can only reach the lower ones anyway. And birds generally strip fruit from the top down because they feel safer at the top. They get a clear advantage to seeing predators. They'll only go for the lower ones when they're really, really desperate. So we kind of meet in the middle. That's the way, you know, with the birds. It's also a great one if you ever fancy trying to make fruit leathers, which are kind of like a fruit roll-up, you know, that you can sometimes buy. You always see them kind of near the checkout in supermarkets. What we can do, hawthorn's great for doing it because it's quite a pulpy, dry fruit. So we can just get a load of the fruit, press them through a sieve just to get rid of all the seed, because inside each hawthorn there's a largish seed, and then we can get all that pulp, spread it out. You can do it on some cling film, it's probably the easiest. Spread it out to a nice thin layer and leave it to dry naturally. And you can add sugar if you want to make it more like a fruit pastel, and it just dries and it becomes leathery, and they're delicious. Fruit leathers are quite an unfashionable way these days of preserving fruit, and they don't keep for, you know, they might keep for a few months, not right the way through winter. But it's fun to kind of play around with it. And hawthorn's an easy one to do with, because if you start doing it with black currants, the juice goes everywhere, and you need to be slightly more professional about making it than with hawthorn, which is far more forgiving. Don't get hawthorn confused with rowan. In reality, there's no way you're going to get them confused with rowan, because hawthorn is a hedge, it's a bush. It's you don't often see it these days as a fully formed tree. you know, unless you're kind of out in the hillsides and, you know, maybe in a park where it's a kind of specimen kind of hawthorn. Rowan is a tree. Rowan, the name Rowan comes from a Gaelic word which means red one, because the berries are just beautiful and shiny and red. And it's a small tree. We don't often get like very old, massive Rowans. If Rowan trees are getting to 100, 150 years old, they're quite old. They generally don't live that long. Whereas for an oak tree, that would be a baby. And they're commonly planted in hedgerows, especially in urban areas. The birds love the berries. The berries are edible once cooked, infused in vinegar or in alcohol. So if you just start eating rowan berries off the bush, you will have an upset stomach if you eat enough of them. But once you've cooked them, infused in alcohol or in vinegar, it destroys the toxin that's in them. And then you can rowan and crabapple jelly. That's the kind of go-to thing. And it's a sacred tree. So it's hard to see on this image, but the bottom of the berries have a little 5-pointed pentagram, this little star on the bottom of the berries. A lot of berries do have this when you start looking, but in a lot of Gaelic countries, they see this tree covered in all these protective symbols, because although we associate the pentagram with kind of evil and witchcraft, it's actually a protective symbol to protect you from evil and witchcraft. So the fact this tree is covered in all of this protective symbol, people kind of held it in high regard. The fact that it's also kind of, it can be edible as well is another reason. So in a lot of kind of Gaelic countries, in old cottages, they often have in their front garden a rowan tree, because that keeps witches from entering the house. And everyone I know who's got a rowan tree in their front garden have always said they've never had a witch knowingly in the house. So there must be some truth in it. Whereas the elder keeps the devil away. And traditionally in Gaelic countries, you would always have an elder in the back garden. So rowan in the front, elder in the back. An elder is the ultimate kind of hedgerow forager's friend. It can support a fungus called gellier. That's for another day, really, because once we start going down the fungi kind of track, there's lots to talk about. And sadly, gellier doesn't get mentioned in this time. But it can support an edible fungus called gellier. But then for beginners, the wonderful world of elderflowers. Now, when we pick our elderflowers, we always have to do it on a hot, sunny day when the oils release all the scent. And you smell every flower you pick, because for about a litre, to make elderflower cordial, or elderflower champagne. Will and I were talking about elderflower champagne before, because that's another go-to recipe. You see, either you make cordial or you make champagne, but we can't call it champagne. It's fizz. Because a friend of mine wrote a book called Booze for Free, and he got a snotty email off the champagne board saying you can't call it champagne. So it's elderflower fizz, I'm afraid. So basically, these flowers are covered in natural yeast. They not only have this wonderful aroma, they have this natural yeast on them. So if we use hot water, so we get some boiling hot water, cover 20 flowers in about a litre of water, add some lemons, that'll make elderflower cordial, because the hot water kills the yeast. If we use cold water, then the yeast survives. And when you add sugar, it will start to ferment. And that's how we get the kind of the alcohol with it. And you know, if you want cordial, that's great. If you want elderflower fizz, that's great as well. But if you make it, use the kind of Grolsch style swing top bottles, because it will constantly be producing gas. And if you just use something that's got a very hard cap, then one day you'll be wandering around the house and then you'll hear lots of explosions coming from the cupboard as all of the bottles explode. So if you're making the fizz, use bottles where the cap can come off if there's too much gas inside. Believe me, from my experience and others that I know, it can be very dangerous making elderflower fizz if you're not careful. But you should smell every single plant you use. And of course, if we don't pick the flowers, then at this time of the year we can pick the berries. And the great thing with elderflowers is when you get elderflower growing in a hedge, you know, one single bush in a hedge could produce over 1,000, 2,000 flowers. If we're making elderflower cordial, we only need 20 to make a litre. So we're not taking that much at all. and we only pick them on a hot sunny day. If you don't, your elderflower cordial will smell of cat wee, and then it will taste like cat wee. And then don't come crying to me when you say, why does my elderflower cordial taste of cat wee? And don't ask me how I know what cat wee tastes like. But if we leave the flowers on, we get the berries at this time of the year. The berries are fantastic because we can do all sorts with them. They are fantastic for flu remedies. So if you go into the pharmacist tomorrow, and I hope you don't have to, if you look at the flu remedies, most of the high-end stuff will say now with elderberry extract. And we now know that patients that have suffered with avian flu, common flu, swine flu, who've been administered vast amounts of elderberry extract have recovered notably quicker and suffered less severe symptoms. So we know it's good for you. How do we use it? Again, like rowan, if you were to just eat these berries raw off the bush, eat enough of them, it'll give you the runs. You know, they will go straight through you, and not really meant to eat these raw. The toxin inside is destroyed, again, by heat, vinegar, and alcohol. So you could make elderberry wine if you wanted to. Someone gave me a bottle they were proud of making years ago of this elderberry wine and said, try that. It's like a good Merlot. And my only conclusion was they've never had a good Merlot. But elderberry vinegar is absolutely to die for. Like such an easy recipe. Basically, we're following a kind of a slow gin recipe where we're filling a Kilner jar with about 2/3 full of elderberries, crush them up, add white wine vinegar, or if you want to be really healthy, organic apple cider vinegar, fill it up. And if you want it more like a balsamic glaze, add some sugar. And it is delicious. And of course, vinegar is a preservative. So it's going to keep right the way through the year. If you make a cordial or a syrup, you got to keep it in the fridge, and it's got about 6 weeks realistically. So it's not going to see you right the way through winter. If you make a vinegar, you could add that with hot water, and it might sound daft, the idea of drinking vinegar, but we call these shrubs, and they're very fashionable in the cocktail world. And this is how in America, before refrigeration, this is how they would make cordials. They wouldn't use water, they would use vinegar because it would preserve them. And we fell out with kind of using vinegar because refrigeration came along. Our palates changed to be very, very sweet, and the idea of drinking vinegar doesn't make sense. But believe me, it is delicious. Or you can just put it on your chips if you want. Elderberry vinegar on chips is absolutely to die for. Yes, there we go. The two culprits: elderflower fizz, elderberry vinegar. They're just two of the most easy, beautiful things. Elder in our hedgerows is just the gift of the gods to us because it is just fantastic. And it's something you can work with in the summer, something you can work with in the autumn as well. It's a wonderful, wonderful plant. I'm always looking for something a bit more exotic though. I make lots of things and I have done over the years, and you're just looking for something a little bit different. And the rubus family, the brambles, is always interesting to me. This is Chinese bramble. So growing up in Manchester, my idea of foraging is not necessarily in this beautiful idyllic countryside, with vast rolling acres of greenery and things like that. It's parks, it's cemeteries, it's urban areas with a bit of green and things like that. That's the reality for many people in the UK, is that's their green spaces. That's where they interact with nature. And one of the benefits is some of these areas are as cosmopolitan as the population around there, with plants that have been introduced, planted, and escaped into the wild. Chinese bramble is quite common around places like Greater Manchester, but many urban areas around the UK. And it is a red blackberry. Does that make sense? Should make sense. It's because if you think blackberries are just blackberries, you're really, really wrong, because there are at least 570 odd different types of blackberry in the wild to start with. So do you know when people say, oh, the blackberries are early this year? Meaningless, absolutely meaningless, unless they are looking at exactly the same bush year in, year out, because some fruit early, some fruit late. And when you start looking at blackberries and brambles, well, blackberries which come from brambles, then you'll start noticing some have large thorns, small thorns, widely spaced thorns, close together thorns. Some have round leaves, triangular leaves, cut leaves, glossy leaves, evergreen leaves, deciduous leaves. Some have white flowers, pink flowers, yellow flowers, red flowers, purple flowers. The berries can be big, they can be small, so much variety. That's how you end up with so many different kind of types. I mean, a favorite of mine is called the cut leaf bramble, where the leaves look like parsley. and that produces the sweetest blackberries. This species, the Chinese bramble, Rubus tricolor, produces these red berries, and importantly, furry stems, not thorny. So it's got these beautiful evergreen glossy leaves with furry stems and these red berries that make absolutely delicious jam. They're fantastic. So we're always looking for something slightly different. And then we can use our more conventional blackberries for blackberry and lavender jam. Lavender should always go with blackberry because it just works so well together. These blackberries are Himalayan giant, one of our commonest varieties, yet it is highly invasive. But most people have never even heard of it. But it's invasive. It's absolutely everywhere, especially in urban areas, but it produces the fattest blackberries you could imagine. So again, in conservation terms, well, we might need to eat our way through it. Oh, how tragic. We're gonna have to eat so much jam and blackberries and things like that. Yeah, it's blackberry and lavender jam. That's absolutely to die for. And then, of course, sometimes in our hedgerows, we find weird things as well that we're not expecting. Walnuts, again, quite commonly around here, especially in urban areas. Walnuts are planted for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they're going cheap, and just sometimes if you're planting trees, then you just want something cheap and cheerful in urban areas and things like that. And walnuts are kind of a no-nonsense tree. They kind of get on with it, but the byproduct is they produce walnuts. The hardest part is beating the squirrels to them. The squirrels are just the vein of my life. They take all my hazelnuts, and it's the reason why I have to pick walnuts when they're green and not let them get through to the nut stage, because by that time the squirrels are on it. So pickled walnuts for me, I'm afraid I never get proper walnuts. But again, illustrates the fact that there are weird things. There are lots of things out there that most people don't expect. The idea of being able to go out into your local area, pick walnuts from your kind of hedgerows seems almost alien to most people, where it should become quite normal. And we should fill our hedgerows with more of these kind of wonderful things. Hazelnuts especially, they're wonderful. Sometimes our hedgerows, though, get friends they don't really want. So this is Japanese knotweed, which can commonly get into a lot of hedgerows, and becomes a bit of a thug. However, we can talk about the conservation values about this for another day. However, something to say, though, is that what most people don't realize is that in the spring, when it's like this, when it looks like pink asparagus spears, it tastes like rhubarb. It tastes exactly like rhubarb. You don't know the difference. So if you can find an area which hasn't been treated, that's the key thing, where it hasn't been sprayed with a load of chemicals. And you can always ask the landowner where you're picking it from if it has been treated. When you see it like this in kind of late March, April, any recipe that uses Japanese rhubarb, you can replace with Japanese knotweed pound for pound. Once it starts producing its leaves, the outer skin starts getting a bit tough. So it's a very short 2 or 3 week window about being able to use Japanese knotweed. And it comes with a caveat. It is illegal to introduce Japanese knotweed anywhere else. So if you were just to pick a load, use a bit of it, and then throw the rest in your brown bin, if the council see it, they will fine you. And it can be up to about £2,000 in some areas. So, and it's, you can't just throw it down the bottom of the garden or over your neighbor's hedge, or things like that. Whatever you pick, you use, basically. You prep everything on the site where you pick it from, and then whatever you don't use at home, and it should be everything, then you stew up and have with ice cream. Nothing should, if you're going to use this plant, it comes with other laws. So you've got to pick everything, But there are restaurants in London that sell Japanese knotweed and custard for like 12 quid. So we're missing a trick here, because considering how much of it there is around in the UK. And when we're foraging, you do have to kind of bear in mind there are some goodies out there. There are some baddies. So this is a sweet Cicely, a member of the Umbellifer family. And it's a very complicated group of plants because it has wonderful edible ones like sweet Cicely, taste of aniseed, strongly of aniseed. And the great thing is the stems are hollow. So you can cut the stems to size and use them as a straw. And you've got this natural aniseed straw that you can then drink with. You get this aniseed flavor. And then whatever you've been drinking with, then you can just chew on the sweet Cicely straw and get all the flavor. So if you've been having, a gin and tonic, a cheeky gin and tonic with a sweet Cicely straw, well, then you've got a gin soaked straw at the end of it that you can chew on like a licorice stick. So it's a wonderful plant. You can also infuse this for making aniseed flavored things. The flowers are wonderful, and the seeds later in the year are like green torpedoes. They're wonderful, sweet. They're very sweet, hence the name Sweet Sicily. And we can just chew on them as we go around the hedgerows. But if you get it wrong, you're messing around with plants like fool's parsley. Fool's parsley, you'll be pleased to know we no longer think will kill you, just make you very unwell unless you've got underlying health conditions, then it probably will kill you. And it's a member of the Umbellifer family, but it has downward facing bracts, these green parts of the plant that are kind of pointing downwards. It sounds like a yoga position. It's actually a botanical term. And it's very common in many of our hedgerows, as is hemlock. So we can't talk about foraging and not mention hemlock. Though in reality, I don't need to warn you about this plant because the plant will warn you about this plant. So the idea that Socrates was killed with a vial of hemlock is nonsense. And any historian that tells you that, they're lying to you, because hemlock is revolting. It tastes awful and it smells of rodent. So people who have tried eating it or have eaten it have all said it's just disgusting, that your body doesn't want you to take it. You know, you've got a lot of mechanisms in your body, including most of your receptors in your tongue are bitter receptors, because a lot of poisons are bitter. So as soon as you taste that, your body instantly wants you to spit it out. So in reality, even if you did have a nibble of this, your body has enough mechanisms to stop you from being poisoned. So in likelihood, people dying from hemlock poisoning, it's not going to happen. The fact it's got purple spots on the stem, etc., smells of rat, it's just another kind of way of being able to avoid it. Its brother, hemlock water dropwort, which is quite common in many hedgerows, tastes delicious, smells pleasant, and will kill you. So what happened throughout history is that the plant that was given during the kind of ancient Greek and Roman times for killing prisoners was this plant, and it's kind of been mistranslated throughout the ages. This plant, if you make a concoction with it, will taste delicious, and so then you can drink it, you can keep it down. There's no mechanism for your body to kind of spew it back up, etc. And of course, then you will ingest enough of it to poison yourself. So we've always got to have in the back of our mind that there are plants out there which are very, very dangerous in the UK. And so things like wild garlic and blackberries and damsons are great for beginners. Once we start messing around with plants like the umbellifers, then we need to kind of be aware of our limitations with our identification. And if you're new to foraging, kind of get used to seeing these plants over a period of a year, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, so you feel confident in your identification. The sinister thing with hemlock water dropwort is in the spring, it looks like celery. As it matures, it looks like carrot. And if you uproot it, it looks like parsnip. So at all stages of its life, it looks like something edible. But generally you find this in wettish areas, wettish hedgerows near canals, rivers, lakesides, places like that. It's very, very common though. Very, very common. I want to finish up just talking about some fungi, because we cannot talk about fungi because A, it's me, and B, it's October. So there's lots of fungi out. September was horrendous for mushrooms and fungi because it was so dry. And mushrooms like it damp. They don't like it too damp either. They are pretty much the Goldilocks of the world. And our hedgerows are a fantastic place to encounter lots of fungi, especially some edible stuff. And they're magical things. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. So on the left, we've got something very typically mushroom shaped. It's not technically a mushroom. A mushroom is a fungal fruiting body that has a stem, a cap, and gills. Well, this doesn't have gills. It has sponge underneath on the left. It's a bolete, which are if you have a mushroom book, the boletes are either at the very front or the very end of the mushroom section, because they're not true mushrooms, but we'll leave that for another day. But where we have here is a parasitic mushroom growing on an earth ball, which is a fungus, because all mushrooms are fungi, not all fungi are mushrooms. Are you with me? Will, nod if that makes sense. He says it makes sense, because the kingdom of fungi covers everything from athlete's foot and dandruff. And if you want, I can get the camera and point it down and show you some weird fungal infections if you want. Or we can do that another night, perhaps, Will. But what we're looking at, when you see these in our hedgerows, our woodlands, anywhere, because fungi occur everywhere, but most people see them along hedgerows because that's generally where we walk. what we're looking at is the fruiting body of a much larger organism. So when we pick our mushrooms, whether it's for eating, whether it's for identification, whatever, we're not doing them any harm. There's no evidence to suggest picking mushrooms has any negative impact on the living part, which is called the mycelium. This is the mycelium. This is the business end of a fungus. In most cases, the mycelium is one cell thick. It's absolutely microscopic, goes through the soil, goes through wood and things like that. This is the mycelium of honey fungus. And honey fungus produces such large mycelium, we call it bootlaces. But this is what it looks like. And just to give you an idea about how much mycelium there is in our kind of hedgerows and our woodlands, in a cubic square inch of soil, in the UK, and especially in the countryside, there's typically about 8 miles of mycelium. That's how much there is. And that's the business end of the fungus. That's doing all the work. The mushrooms and the kind of other weird fruiting bodies we see, they are the spore-bearing parts of the fungus. And they hopefully drift off in the wind and hopefully form new versions of themselves. But when we pick, it's not the same because they're not plants. When we pick an apple from the apple tree, we don't kill the apple tree. It's similar with fungi. When we pick the mushrooms, we don't kill the living part of the fungus. So that's what the look looks like. And in our hedgerows, we do find some wonderful species. So not far from where I live, about 1/4 mile away, there's a beautiful beech hedge, which goes this lovely kind of beautiful amber golden color at this time of the year as the beech leaves kind of change. And it's an old hedge. It's because usually when you see beech trees, they're always massive, but because it's been cut so long, it's an old hedge, but doesn't look anywhere near as old as it has. And it's got lovely fungi growing with it because beech, oak, birch, they are prolific associates with fungi. And it produces associates with this species, which is the Amethyst deceiver, which is edible. If you're looking at this thinking this is poisonous, then you're judging a book by its cover, and shame on you. But this is an edible species that grows commonly with beech and oak as well. And it's absolutely beautiful. You don't just get one, you get thousands of Amethyst deceivers. And they get the name deceiver because when they dry, they go almost a very pale lilac. When they're wet, they go really dark, dingy, purpley brown. And this is them at their best, so hence the name deceiver. And then there are other things. So our hedgerows are filled with things like porcini. So what the Italians call porcini, the French call cep, we call penny bun. But no one's heard of penny bun because it's just, we generally adopt, of anything that's delicious in the kind of fungal world, we adopt the French or Italian names for generally than the English name. So people have heard of porcini or cep, not penny bun. If you saw penny bun risotto, you'd be questioning what on earth it was. And again, it grows commonly in our hedgerows, but because the British have a kind of a weird attitude towards mushroom, then people don't pick them, and they just rot. Or worse, kids get taught they're bad and then kick them, etc. It's even worse. The other thing is as well with mushrooms is they vary so much. This is a little porcini, and then this is what it would look like if we let it go big. This is the size of my head. That's a kilo of mushroom. So you've got everything in between. So that's the reason why we're kind of a bit of a pain. We've always got to up-to-date literature when we're foraging. This is the brown roll rim. There's a book on the shelf behind me that describes it as edible. We now know it's deadly poisonous. And we now know that because a Polish mycologist killed himself from eating so much of this mushroom. And this is common in our hedgerows as well. Very, very common. It's brown and the rim rolls back on the underside. So the cap kind of comes back and folds over. So we've always got to up-to-date literature. And there are laws when it comes to mushrooms. 2005 Drug Act. The psilocybin family grow commonly in parts of our hedgerows because we've introduced a species from South America inadvertently. And lots of hedgerows where people put wood chip down or they get trimmed and things like that, there's the shavings underneath, the blue leg brownie can appear, which is technically a Class A drug. But it grows, there was a hedgerow at B&Q car park not far from where I lived, where all of the car park was covered in this Class A drug. And when we got a new kitchen, you kind of ask B&Q, it's like, I'll keep it quiet. You're growing a load of Class A drugs if you can knock some money off the kitchen. Anyway, they weren't interested. But this species grows absolutely everywhere. It turns blue when you damage it, hence the name blue leg brownie. So some species you've got to be aware of about the laws, etc. We'll say in 2 minutes. That's fair enough. I'm sorry, everyone. I can talk for England on this. And some fungi we get on when our hedgerows are rotting as well, they have become vital important for lots of fungi, especially medicinal fungi. Turkey tail, hugely medicinal. And if you Google turkey tail, it's now been known for boosting the immune system. And grows, like I say, very commonly on our hedgerows. You can make tea with it. So the idea of making a fungal tea, etc., doesn't appeal to everyone, but you can. I know gin companies that use this as a flavoring because it gives it an earthy kind of flavor, and we can make tea with it. There are things in our hedgerows that will kill you, mushroom-wise. Death cap, don't eat this. It smells sickly sweet. Smells very tempting to eat, but don't eat that one. Chanterelle, a deliciously edible species, again quite common in our hedgerows, but we just neglect to pick these things. Our European friends have been doing it for centuries and centuries and centuries, year after year after year, and we just don't bother doing it. Chicken of the woods is another one. It's a fabulous species, grows on usually rotting oak trees, can grow on a variety of other things, and in the last few years I've seen it on more stuff like willow and cherry, and it's just this massive kind of yellow lump growing out of the tree, but it's absolutely delicious. Scarlet elf cups, again, they're not really edible. Social media kind of go mad for making these into vol au vents and stuff, but these have increased in recent years in our hedgerows, become very, very common. Where you get a nice understory under a hedge with kind of mossy branches and things like that, then you find this very, very commonly, as you do the shaggy ink cap, which starts to deliquesce. There's your word of the day. Turns to liquid. So the gills start white, and then they end up this inky mess, which you can use as ink and write and draw its own mushroom and its ink, etc. And I will leave you with the fly agaric, the red one with the white spots. Again, quite common in our hedgerows, especially where there's birch. And I could talk for hours and hours and hours about this one species, but your challenge, don't eat this one. Not only will you hallucinate, you'll be very ill as well. But it's such an iconic species that who can't go out and be inspired to kind of go look for more mushrooms and stuff when you see, the absolute fairy mushroom, red one with the white spots. So hopefully it's a whistle stop tour of the foraging world in 40 minutes. I know Will is kind of probably, gritting through his teeth that I've slightly gone over my time, but there's so much to talk. It's a fraction. We're scratching the surface of the foraging world, but hopefully you have been inspired to kind of go out this weekend and think, well, maybe see what's on, in our hedgerows, because I guarantee there'll be absolutely loads. And even if you don't find anything, which you will, there is always lots of nature to kind of interact with and have a look anyway. So I shall say thank you for listening, and shall we have some questions?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Dave. That's absolutely brilliant. I think everyone's probably learned many things. If everyone's like me, they've learned a lot, so that's brilliant. Few questions I've got. We'll do a whistle stop round of questions.
Yeah.
Uses for ground elder, please.
Uses for ground elder, anything that's like spinach. So you can use it as a substitute. Very early in the spring, you can use the leaves raw. They're so soft and delicate. As they start to get a little bit older, they get tougher. So you need to kind of put a bit of heat through them. And that's how I'd use it. But you can, basically anything in the spring that requires spring greens, use ground elder. I had some friends who had it such a weed in their garden that once they realized they could eat their way through it, they were complaining there's barely anything left because they've just been hammering it for year after year after year. So there'll be someone, even if you can't find it in the wild or you don't want to take it from the wild, there'll be someone over the garden who does weed it and just throws it in the brown bin. So yeah, I would definitely, I love it. Just make sure it is ground elder because it is in the Umbellifer family, but it's quite distinctive in its own right.
Somebody else has asked, do you make walnut wine?
I've given up making wines altogether. I used to have a friend when I was living in Rochdale that used to make. I used to kind of find all the forage stuff. He'd make the wine. He was very into homebrew, and I learned very on. But the problem is where I am now. If I was to make a vat of something, generally it wants to be kept at quite a similar temperature, whereas mine would fluctuate between 30 degrees during the day and -5 at night. There's nowhere ideal in the house for doing this. And the amount of times I made wines and it's like, this tastes just like a bad vinegar. So I gave up. So I gave everything to him and it'd come back. So I've never made walnut wine. I've made oak leaf. And depending if you use oak leaves in the spring, if it's spring, it's a sweet wine. If you use them in the autumn, it's a dry wine. But I've never used walnut leaves. No.
Brilliant.
No.
I feel your pain trying to make wine and tasting that vinegar. I've also done that as well.
That's why liqueurs are far easier,
Yeah.
and cordials as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess a question which I'm keen to know, just for everyone's sake, I guess, is that if I'm out there foraging in the hedgerows and I'm not sure about anything, what do I do?
Don't eat it. I know that sounds daft, but it's crucial. If you're 99.9% sure you know what it is, leave it alone. You need to be 100%. Ask someone, find a local expert, or Twitter. I'm online as Discover. Someone just mentioned Twitter handle, Discover the Wild. All that comes through to me. Just start everything with "I'm about to eat," not "I have just eaten." And yeah, but a good field guide. I'd like to say an app, but I can't because I've tried so many, and sometimes they get it right. Some plant ones are getting good, mushroom ones are terrible. But a good field guide. You just need to consult a good field guide and check off everything it says. Does it look like this? Does it look like this? Does it have this? Does it have this? And it has all that. It can only be that. And sometimes when you're learning new species, you do tear your hair out and think, I don't know. But if you're unsure, watch the plant through its stage. So if it's just in the leaf stage, because the thing is with spring foraging, you are identifying plants just from their leaf. That's quite advanced botany when you think about it, because you're not seeing the flowers and you're not seeing, everything else. So if you're unsure, watch the plant through over the course of a year. What does it look like when it's just starting off? What does it look like when it's in flower? What does it look like when it's gone over? Are all these things ticking the boxes of what you think it should look like? Because if you're expecting it to have, bright pink bauble flowers and it's got blue ones, something's gone horribly wrong with your identification. So get a good field guide. There's plenty of kind of Facebook groups that are into foraging. I like a quiet life, so I'm not part of any of them, I'm afraid. But yeah, people can tag me in Twitter and what have you and say, you found this, do I know what it is? And I'm always happy to help. It's a bit silly season at the minute, so it might take me a little while to reply, but yes. I just noticed someone says, can you eat young beech leaves? They look delicious. You can, so long as they're furry around the edge. So in spring, they're that lovely light green, lime green with little hairs around the edge. As long as they've got the hairs, they're soft enough to eat. When they lose the hairs, they become too tough. So yes, you can use beech leaves, and you can throw them into salads and all sorts. They don't have much flavor, but they will bulk out something. You can use them for all sorts of other things as well. Again, you can make wine with beech leaves and liqueurs and things. But so long as I always think, so long as they've got the hairs around the edge, then yes, absolutely. Have I made acorn coffee? No. I tell a lie. Yes, when I was younger, I really don't rate acorns. I might. Yeah, it's quite fashionable with some young foragers to be making acorn flour and things like that. I just think humanity did such a great job with things like wheat that we kind of nailed it. When you make, especially this year, because it's such a good acorn year compared to previous years, it is tempting to try and think, I should do something with them. Whenever I do anything with acorns, I just get very disappointed very quickly. And I'd rather spend my time with something else. I'd rather pick bullaces or blackberries or hawthorn than acorns.
I appreciate we've gone over a little bit. We'll have one more question and then we'll finish. But can you use conkers for washing?
You can. I've never done it, but I know people who tell me they use. I've got some friends that are kind of more interested in the kind of to make fabric and kind of interested in plants in terms of their dyeing kind of capabilities and things like that, and some fungi as well. There's some fungi that are used in dyeing, and they use conkers quite a bit. And I'm sure in part of the washing of fabric they use conkers. So I think you can use conkers for washing. The only thing I kind of would use conkers for is to getting rid of the massive spiders that lurk around in this house. I love all parts of natural history, but spiders. It's the fact they just creep up on me everywhere I go. So you can put conkers in the corners of the room, and that's meant to keep spiders out. I don't think it works. You just probably end up with rotting conkers. You smell of rotting conkers after a few months.
Yeah, we'll have to try that one.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thanks so much, Dave. Yeah, I think everyone's really, really enjoyed the talk, and yeah, we've all learned so much. So can I say thank you for that?
I hope so. Sorry for going over, everyone.
No, I think everyone was absolutely fine with you going over, because everyone was just, yeah, really interested in everything.
I don't think Bake Off's on tonight, so we're not missing anything important, are we?
Yeah, I'm not sure it is, so that's good. Right, yeah, so thank you, everyone. Thanks, Dave, and thank you absolutely everyone for tuning in and watching. It's been great. Come along to our other Hedge Talks happening every evening. If you want to look at the kind of the itinerary, go to www.nationalhedgerowweek.org.uk or check out our Tree Council website, www.treecouncil.org.uk for more information. But for now, thank you very much and good night.